Al's better, far too generous, far too generous. Kia ora, everyone. Good morning. Before I start, I'm an engineer doing economics, so I'm going to be highly reliant on my cheat sheets here. Distinguished guests, industry colleagues. So, due to this being a biogas conference and it being hosted in Wellington, I'm told economics absolutely has to be on the agenda. I have to warn you, it's a tricky combination. Every economics teacher I have ever encountered has been very comfortable relying on the principles of induced demand, continual growth, and linear consumption models, with a sprinkling of environmental externalities established alongside as an afterthought. However, anaerobic digestion, as a platform, it actually confronts that established economic doctrine. For example, counting the same recycled atom of carbon or nitrogen multiple times as it passes through a digester violates multiple laws of economics. Calculating the NPV of public goods 30 years from now, who does that? Or putting a dollar value on quite objectionable waste material that most people would turn their nose up and rather just disappear. I think there was a reason why my most recent economics lecturer gave me the side eye when I told him I'm attempting to turn yesterday's lunch into tomorrow's energy with today's money. But he's not here today, so let's begin. Sorry, just figure this out. Currently on screen is Güstrow Bioenergy Park, located in eastern Germany. I was very proud to have been on the commissioning team of this 2 petajoule facility back in the winter of 2009. We were quietly helping the Germans push back Russian gas back towards Poland. It's very sad that their long-held concerns about inevitable Russian aggression have come to pass, but it just goes to show how important energy security is in the European context. It also helps to provide some background to some of the figures and prices that will be given in this presentation. In just 2 years, Europe has managed to pivot about 25% or 4,000 petajoules of its natural gas import away from Russia. This has been absolutely astonishing and achieved by a raft of domestic efficiency measures combined with a rapid pivot to LNG imports from the US and the Middle East. A silver lining that has been created because of all this is some breathing room for the German government to focus on some other areas of their decarbonisation portfolio, including heavy vehicle fuels. The Bioenergy Park answered that call, and late last year a liquefaction process for the biomethane and biogenic CO2 was added to the facility. The same AD reactors now process increased manure fraction in their feedstock, which is able to deliver net negative emissions with high demand liquefied biomethane among the European fleet operators. This is an excellent example of the versatility of anaerobic digestion as a decarbonisation services platform, efficiently processing wastes with the produced energy being able to pivot between renewable electricity, pipeline gas, or heavy vehicle fuel, depending on the highest need. I ask everyone in the audience to keep this versatility in mind as we take a look at the capital and revenue supports provided in different countries in order to secure the same versatility for their own waste management and energy sectors. So again, we're talking about Europe. Europe is considered as the leading market for commercially owned and operated AD facilities, and this is not an accident. The European Union has a long track record of leveraging import tariffs on fossil fuels, along with energy consumption taxes to fund the development of renewable energy amongst its member states. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has served to galvanise this position and accelerate efforts with the establishment of the Repower EU grant fund that Charlotte touched on earlier, of about €300 billion in conjunction with government-backed credit through the InvestEU programme for a further €370 billion. This is across all renewables, mind you, and they have a clear mandate to reduce Europe's energy import dependency. From a total funding pool of almost €1 trillion in grants and preferential loans, member states get to set eligibility and merit criteria to fund anywhere between 20 and 65% of renewable infrastructure costs. And 37, as Charlotte mentioned, €37 billion of this pool has been specifically earmarked for biomethane. And if you look at the 3 years since the Renew EU policy has been in play, they has enabled 200 petajoules of installed capacity just in those 3 years, so it's amazing. This includes many new greenfield biomethane projects, along with retrofitting existing AD facilities to produce biomethane where they have proximity to the grid. and then in cases like Gustro, producing vehicle fuel. However, it's not all smooth sailing. It is widely anticipated that the bloc will restate their 35 billion cubic metre biomethane target. By the way, this is equivalent to 1,400 petajoules or 1.4 exajoules, so this is large amounts of energy, 10% roughly of its entire annual gas demand. So to deliver that by 2030 is obviously a tall order, considering they've only delivered 20% of that as of this year. So the required run rate is just out of this world. So one way that they could salvage that position would be to count the production of all biogases. So this is raw biogas and biomethane. So on that metric, they're a lot better position. That's 65% of that target currently, and they would represent 11% annual growth rate between now and 2030 to deliver that. And they have delivered 11% increases in capacity in the past. So that would basically change the whole mindset to producing the molecules now and then let their use evolve over time. So it remains to be seen what will happen. Okay, now bringing it a bit closer to home. Sorry about the scaling on this graph. It was rather rushed, I have to say. But what we've got here is capital investments for a selection of AD biomethane projects that I've been involved with in some capacity over the last 10 years. They've converted into New Zealand dollars and at 2021 prices for ease of comparison. Please note these are only indicative as they cross multiple countries over the span of a decade. Feedstocks and biomethane end use are also wildly different between each example. What is useful to see from the vertical dashed lines are the reference projects defined in the UK's Green Gas Support Scheme. Those roughly correspond to 220, 360 and 950 terajoules in terms of 3 reference sizes. So for the purposes of today's economics discussion, we're going to assume a New Zealand reference project, denoted by the red cross in the middle of the slide, which is loosely based upon the largest tier UK facility at 950 TJ, and it would represent a $160 million New Zealand dollar investment today, in today's money. Now we look at revenue stack. These pie graph to show the revenue makeup of AD biomethane projects, contrasting typical European and North American components. In both cases, government support via direct feed-in tariff or tax credit contributes to about 1/3 of that stack. This single source of revenue is incredibly important for bankability in many jurisdictions, including ones just starting off, pretty much exclusive rule around the world. If you wanted to start a biomethane industry, you need to have a fixed price, energy-based tariff or tax credit to the same effect, which is transparent and it's bankable. It's backed by some kind of state government or legislation. Developed EU markets such as Germany, Denmark or France are now planning the transition to a tender process to secure volumes of biomethane over and above existing feed-in tariffs at the lowest cost to the state, but with the intent of superseding the feed-in tariff mechanisms in future. Next, we have energy attribute certification, or in New Zealand, NZECs, or in Europe, they're called guarantees of origin. This is absolutely clear, especially in markets with lower wholesale energy prices. So in the case of the US, we have a scheme called the Renewable Injection Number, which is essentially their certificate mechanism. And in a market like the US, we have a very low wholesale energy price. The effect of the certificate is absolutely critical to these projects. The importance of feedstock and biogas carbon intensity accounting becomes very apparent in developed markets, where certificate trading is forecasted to become the primary source of revenue for renewable gases as state subsidies fall away and tax credits. This forecasted to become the primary revenue source. At the World Biogas Summit held last week, and some of the concerns mentioned before by Charlotte, multiple speakers touched on the importance of building trust in the attribute certification market by addressing the fragmented carbon accounting standards currently in use worldwide. This is an extremely important aspect to get right, as it is the very foundation of energy attribute trading. So we have Insa Every and Eleanor Grant, who will be covering the carbon accounting aspects of biogas production in the industrial environment later this afternoon. Also for mention here is the American or the US government has taken more of a generalist approach and does not currently differentiate between anaerobic digestion and landfill gas derived biomethane. So both of those feed sources are eligible for the various categories of RIN certificate and more recently a production tax credit. This is quite a generous approach for scaling industry, and they have scaled quite rapidly in the past few years. But it does introduce some considerable risk in relation to carbon intensity accounting moving forwards, especially if we see commonalities between the European and North American markets going forwards and more international trading going on. The remaining, and because of this, 70% of all US upgrading projects are currently derived from landfill gas. The remaining 30% of US biomethane is largely derived from on-farm manure installations with a bit of co-digestion. And this could be the foundation for a revised set of incentives to take the industry in a more sustainable direction at the right time in the future. Okay, now we sort of zoom in a bit closer and compare a bit more directly. So here we compare revenue supports by market. So we can see the progression of revenue support for AD biomethane. So just for benefit, revenue support is an ongoing payment akin to the green premium that covers your additional cost of capital to get a project off the ground and also your additional operation costs. So revenue support is some mechanism that bridges that gap, as opposed to a grant fund, which just helps you with upfront spend. Unfortunately, no biomethane-specific revenue supports are available in New Zealand, but I've considered limited revenues from the sale of wholesale gas and co-products such as bio-CO2 and digestate. Cognizant that these markets are in the infancy, and due to the hard mahi of ecogas and Bioenergy Association of New Zealand, they're on there. Missing from the graph is the gate fee revenue, less consolidation and sorting costs. I'm unclear on exact figures. Obviously, we're very early in that space, but I believe you could probably add somewhere between $15 and $20 per gigajoule on top of the New Zealand revenue stack there for comparison. But we still have a delta. So that's the secret sauce that ecogas has quite eloquently shown to everyone in this part of the world. It is possible, but you need to have the right layering or stitching together of the right revenue contracts, whether that be with a municipality, and also making sure every single co-product is valorised. So it's an amazing achievement. I have to say, I've been in this industry for coming up 20 years, and to have an unsubsidised project in this part of the world is actually quite amazing. So yeah, I'd just like to ask everyone to join with me in a round of applause, just for ecogas. Yeah. So getting back on topic, in the middle of the graph we can compare the UK, US and French grid injection tariffs. So again, we're a step up, typically over $50 a gigajoule, all considered. And this is all because there's state-based feed-in tariffs based on an energy value. And then as we move to the right-hand side of the graph here, we have the very high-value product. So this is bio-LNG that is intended to be a heavy vehicle fuel replacement. So we're pushing $100 a gigajoule in terms of all-up revenue. So we're orders of magnitude away from that. Yeah, well, let's say multiples. And another really interesting thing recently in the bioenergy news is a few LNG producing facilities and also import terminals in Europe are now collaborating around virtual bio-LNG production. So that's essentially a displacement trade where someone in Europe will say, look, I've certified my injection into the grid somewhere in Europe, and because we're treating Europe as a interconnected system, we don't need to regasify a unit corresponding energy unit of fossil LNG somewhere else in the system. So this is a very interesting space, and it has the potential to scale quite rapidly as we get uptake in that space, because you've basically saved yourself the cost of a biomethane liquefaction facility, because you're using existing capacity in the fossil space to do that. So really interesting developments, and you can see it's far on the right-hand side of revenue potential. New Zealand, that's probably not going to help so much. We're isolated down here, so let's just focus on the belts and braces. Let's focus on the basic level of support to get these projects off the ground outside of the great work that EcoGas have done. Okay, so here I'm just going to FUD you with even more numbers. These are potential drivers in the New Zealand market. So it's been quite topical in the news recently. We're talking about energy security. We're talking about what are we going to do when gas production volumes really put the squeeze on. Are we going to be importing LNG? And so this price range here is basically the Japan-Korea marker for LNG imports out of Asia. So if we're sourcing LNG from Asia, it's currently $20 when I checked today. It's about $12 US per gigajoule. So $20 New Zealand. And that ramps pretty rapidly when there's an international event that involves energy or natural gas. So it's quite volatile. So obviously with the Ukraine war, that did hit $60 plus a gigajoule. So if we're considering that as a new marginal source of gas for the country, then why can't biomethane play in that space, or maybe slightly below it? So this is a contributor for separated fruit organics supported by landfill levy. Again, there's downside risk on this price because you have to sort that material. Sometimes you have to consolidate it, and there's also contamination. So $30 a gigajoule is definitely optimistic, and you'd probably see less than half of that in an actual operational project. These are the figures for non-pastoral manure emissions in New Zealand. So they're not currently part of the emissions trading scheme, nor is any of our agriculture. But just throwing these figures up there, not saying that's an appropriate move for our country and how our agricultural system is structured. But these are the figures involved with that non-pastoral manure. So this means manure that's not in the paddock, it's in a milking shed or it's in a barn or some kind of facility that you could potentially collect that from. But obviously very distributed around the North Island and the regional Southern Island as well. That potentially has 7 petajoules of energy potential if it was all managed to be converted into biomethane, which is probably not likely because a lot of it will be hard to locate and access. Here we have a biogenic CO2 price, if we're pricing that at $300 a tonne for a commercial shipment of liquefied fossil-based CO2. So potentially you could add that onto a business case. Here we have maybe a slightly controversial one. I know Minister Watts has left, but we did have a Giddy partnership in the previous government, probably waiting to see if that gets rebranded into something else, or there's obviously a few announcements today which are quite promising, but in that partnership we had an average abatement cost of $120 per tonne of CO2, so that could roughly represent $6 a gigajoule if it was a biomethane molecule going to an industrial gas user. Here's probably an outside chance of biomethanol price in the US, so around $770 US a tonne. So that could roughly translate to $30 a gigajoule, assuming a 50% efficiency in that process. So I talked about a New Zealand reference project. So this is a 950 terajoules, $130 million no, sorry, that figure's incorrect. That's why it's highlighted. That figure would be what I mentioned earlier, which was the 150. See, I told you I'd need these notes. And I'll put you to sleep already. 160 million in today's money over 15 years. These are our figures. So we have a marginal LNG cost, assuming that we're displacing a unit of LNG coming into the country. So we'd be trying to replicate the virtual system that they're trying to stand up in Europe at the moment. We'd have a returned GIDI fund, so a recognition of the industrial decarbonisation that's possible through biomethane use. We'd have an NZEC, which is a gas energy certificate trading on top of that, and potential co-product income. Now, taking some direct OPEX modelled from European projects, that's very optimistic as well, because that assumes European supply chains and industry experience, and also very optimistic feedstock, where we've assumed 5% of agricultural energy crop, and the rest of the 95% being waste derived with a gate fee attached. Yeah, we basically arrive at a very slim 10% IRR under that scenario. So that is very slim pickings for someone looking to develop a biomethane project, especially for a long-term capital outlay and with a lot of risks, as people mentioned earlier. So potential ways that we could look for upside on that would be to consider maybe the investment tax credit that was mentioned earlier introduced by the National Party in this term of government, which is very promising, or perhaps a mandated level of industrial offtake for renewable gases in conjunction with the existing waste bins and eco-grants and preferential development loans. So on top of that, we could potentially stand up a project. So with that, I'll leave the presentation with a quote that stuck with me a few different ways each time I've read it. And that's, we'll have what we need if we use what we have. And that was attributed to Edgar Kahn, who was one of the speechwriters for a former US President, Robert Kennedy. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Why don't you both hop on stage, because they're questions for both of you. There's quite a few questions that have come in, so over the last two presentations, so I'll fire some of them as I go through them. Some of the questions you've put in are going to be answered in later presentations, so if I ignore your question, I'm not ignoring it, it's just coming up later. That's that one. That's that one. I'm going to fire this one to you, Asbeta. I can hardly read it. Given acetic acid appears to be a primary product of acidogenesis and is a flammable compound, could we use it instead of methane in some contexts? Does that make sense to you?
It does. We could, if we can harvest it without throwing the anaerobic digestion process out, and that is impossible. And so we would end up with very overloaded, very smelly anaerobic digestion facilities. So we need to take the system as it is and drive it all the way through the degradation process, all the way to methane. Otherwise, it would be potentially a disaster.
Excellent. And in a similar vein, can we mix different organic sources, for example, agricultural waste and food waste with biocrop within the same AD process?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what we should be doing, because that's something I haven't mentioned. It's single source or single type feedstock facilities will have a risk of being misbalanced in terms of nutrients and trace elements. So the more variety of feedstock you have, the more balanced diet you have as well. And also there's also a lesser risk of upsets, or when your primary feedstock falls off, then you've got all the other feedstocks to rely on. So it's a way of strengthening not only the commercial model, but also the biological system.
Similarly, when we're talking about the digestate, is direct ingestion of digestate the best application for land spreading? Could injection into irrigation system water be an acceptable solution?
I'm a bit I'm going to be honest about it. The risk of volatilizing ammonia out of digestate through spray irrigation of the product is relatively high, and that's why the UK have abandoned the splash plate application. So I would tread with caution in this space, and I would put my name behind land spreading or ground spreading being the best use of the product. And it's the best way to get the nitrogen to the ground, to the plants as quickly as possible without minimizing losses.
Okay. And Richard, do you think we should focus on higher revenue applications, for example, transport, or lower cost applications, for example, network injection?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have to start somewhere. And so I was lucky enough to be involved in the first biogas upgrader in Denmark. And it basically, that was the bellwether for how this industry develops everywhere in the world. So that was a small-scale water wash system upgrading sludge residue from a wastewater treatment plant. And the landfill, and then shortly after that, there was a landfill gas project I wasn't involved in. And then the world's largest project, which is definitely a landfill gas project over in Montreal, or what I should say, one of the largest that's been superseded recently. So these industries always have to build up from a readily available feedstock, and so that's your wastewater treatment plant, your landfill. You need to valorize that first. You need to get confidence in the market. You need your investors to come along and have a look at it in the domestic market. And the best way of doing that is, behind the meter biogas power generation and heat use. That's that's commonplace. That's just financial common sense if you've got the resource. But then beyond that is develop your wastewater treatment gas, develop your landfill gas, and then you go to these, what Europe's doing with all sorts of variations on that.
Yeah, and look, I think that point about there's no substitute for seeing a plant in operation, and it really does make it real. I think that's part of the challenge here in New Zealand. We haven't had the plants until now for people to go and have a look at. So it does feel like this is something where we will get ahead of steam once we get, we have one really good plant now. Once we get a couple more, it starts to become real, and the investment opportunities become more concrete. Elsbeta, how much of the energy produced in AD is required for heating the AD process?
So it's depending on the size of the AD plant, and it really benefits from economies of scale. It's somewhere between 5 and 15% of covering the total energy demand of an AD facility. So that includes electricity and heat of the plant. What we had seen in some of the European markets is that they're actually using heat pumps to produce the heat for the AD plant, because the biogas is so much more valuable as a product rather than as a source of the energy. We're obviously not there yet, but it's something worth considering.
That's really interesting. And before you go away, is following on from the use of the digestate, is it particularly more applicable in hydroponics?
I'll leave that one for Ben Smith from DNG to answer in his session. That's not my. I couldn't probably speak on behalf of the horticulture industry on this topic.
So again, on the economic side of things, and again, it may be that we don't have enough of an industry to answer this question yet, but how much higher is the CapEx and OpEx for plants in New Zealand compared to reference overseas projects, smaller plants, dispersed feedstocks, and so on?
Yeah, I had that slide up a bit earlier, but we compare, in terms of CapEx, for a facility, it's well within the expected range of reference projects internationally for New Zealand's first project. However, as you scale, I think you're going to come to pinch points around probably connection costs to various different network configurations, and also the fact that we have a very limited supply chain here, and we'll be quite reliant on European technology providers who can actually give a technical guarantee for their process to make it bankable. So I think in that scenario, I think when you're rapidly scaling, there's an upside risk on that capex figure. In terms of OPEX, there's a very good question there around diversity of feedstocks and their geographical location. Yeah, that's certainly a cost adder in terms of your OPEX of your plant. But yeah, if we can somehow look to, again, follow EcoGas's brilliant example of backhauling logistics or any other kind of optimization you can do around trying to aggregate that stuff and get it to a location where it can be put to good use. But yeah, I think from what we've seen to date, we're not an outlier in terms of capex at least. So yeah.
Are there any more questions from people who haven't thrown them in the Slido app that want to have roving mics? Throw your hand up. No, okay. We've got a bit of time up our sleeves, and so instead of doing one of our sponsor presentations at lunchtime, I'm going to call on Verbrek to come up now and do their presentation. They're going to give you lunchtime. So can we just have a big round of applause for Richard and Elzbieta? Thank you.